guys, Mitch from Shock Therapy, and today we're going to be showing you how to install the dual rate spring kit on the Polaris RZR Pro R Sport and Premium Edition. This spring kit's going to do multiple things for you guys. Not only does it increase the ride height, it also helps smooth out the chop and chatter through the small bumps or washboards. It's also going to help with the bottom out resistance when you guys hit the bigger G-outs or bigger jump landings. Our spring kit, unlike the factory spring kit, is going to take one initial set after the first 300 to 400 miles. We do highly recommend that when you guys are checking this after that time frame, that your ride heights are within that 18.5 inches in the front and 18 inches in the rear. This in return is going to give you guys the best ride quality that you can get out of your vehicle. This spring kit is a little bit more in depth, so give yourself 2 to 3 hours to install it. Let's jump on in. I'm going to show you guys how to do it.
Your first step in the installation is to jack the front of the vehicle up until both tires are off the ground. Next, add jack stands for added safety. Using an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket, remove the factory sway bar link from the factory sway bar. This will help with the removal of the front shock. Next, remove the factory lower hardware using a 21mm socket and a 21mm wrench. Using the same socket and same wrench, you can now remove the upper hardware. You can also use an electric impact to make the process faster. And then remove the front shock. Place the shock in a spring compressor and use a flathead to lower the bump stop a couple of inches to remove the factory retainer. Compress the springs carefully and remove the factory lower spring retainer. Remove the lower spring, followed by the two-piece factory divider, and then remove the upper spring. You can now begin setting your preload and crossover measurements. The preload will be set at 1 inch. Using a hammer and a flathead screwdriver, loosen the preload collars and set your starting point measurement to 2 3/4 of an inch. Make sure to snug down the crossovers using a flathead screwdriver and a mallet. Install the new upper spring, making sure that the logo on the spring is upside down. Reinstall the factory two-piece divider, followed by the new lower spring. Make sure to clock both spring ends 180 degrees apart from each other. Carefully compress the spring system and install the factory lower spring retainer. Release the spring tension and begin installing the shock back onto the vehicle. Install the shock the same way that it came out and begin installing the upper hardware. Insert the upper bolt followed by the nut on the backside. You can now lower the vehicle just slightly until the lower loop lines up with the arm mount and insert the factory bolt followed by the nut on the backside. With the shock installed, you can now reinstall the factory sway bar link, making sure that you leave it loose at this time. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. With both front shocks reinstalled, you can now remove the jack stands and lower the vehicle back onto the ground. Next, jack up the rear of the vehicle until both tires are off of the ground. Reinsert your jack stands for added safety. Using a 21mm wrench and 21mm socket, remove the factory lower hardware. Using the same tools, you can now remove the upper hardware. Remove the upper shock hardware and remove the shock from the vehicle. Place the shock into the spring compressor and again lower the bump stop using a flathead screwdriver a couple of inches. Compress the spring system and remove the factory lower spring retainer. Remove the lower spring, the factory divider, and the upper spring. Begin setting your preload and crossover starting point measurements. The preload measurement is going to be set at 2 inches. Loosen the factory crossover and begin setting your starting point at 5 inches. Make sure to tighten the factory crossovers. Next, install the new upper spring, making sure that the logo is facing upside down. Install the factory plastic divider, making sure that the long end of the divider is facing towards the crossover. Install the lower spring and make sure that both spring ends are 180 degrees apart. Carefully compress the spring system and reinstall the factory lower spring retainer. Release the spring tension, remove the shock from the spring compressor, and begin installing it back onto the vehicle. Reinstall the upper shock hardware, followed by the lower hardware, making sure that you leave the hardware loose at this time. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. With both rear shocks reinstalled, you can now remove the jack stands and lower the vehicle back onto the ground. Using a designated driver, drive the vehicle back and forth a couple of times, hitting the brakes to settle the suspension. On the final stop, make sure that you come to a coasting stop without hitting the brakes. Begin checking the measurements of your ride heights in the front of the vehicle. This is done on the lower control arm closest to the firewall and should be measured at 18.5 inches. Next, check the rear ride height measurement. This is done from the lower part of the frame where the radius rod connects to the pull plate. This measurement should be set at 18 inches. With your ride height measurements set, you can now begin checking the crossover gap measurement. The rear should be set at 2.5 inches from the crossover to the top of the plastic divider. The front measurement should be set at 1 to 1.5 inches from the bottom of the crossover to the top of the plastic divider. With all your ride heights and crossover measurements set, you can now begin tightening down the front shock, starting with the upper hardware first, finishing with the lower hardware, and making sure that you retighten the sway bar link to the factory sway bar. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. Next, tighten down the rear shock hardware, starting with the upper and finishing with the lower using the 21mm wrench and 21mm socket. Repeat these steps on the opposite side, and your installation is complete.
We hope that this video helped you guys with the installation of your spring kit at home. The most important thing to remember when installing any spring kit is to check the ride heights after that 300 to 400 miles. Also, if you guys are adding weight or subtracting weight, your ride height numbers are always going to be changing. So make sure that you stay within that 18.5 and 18-inch ride height mark. All of our spring kits are made in the USA and they do carry a lifetime warranty. If you'd like to order this spring kit, feel free to visit the website at www.shocktherapyusa.com. For any technical help or questions on this install or any other products, feel free to reach out to the shop at 623-217-4959. Also, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the bell to be notified anytime that we post a new video.